It has been and still is a hard time for many. But tonight, we turn the page. Tonight, after a breakthrough year for America, our economy is growing and creating jobs at the fastest pace since 1999.
President Barack Obama is either the knight in shining armor who is without fear and leading America to a new promised land, or he's just another huckster politician using a State of the Union to give his followers a nice warm and fuzzy with no real substance. And the winner is... Welcome to Midpoint, former governor of Arkansas, former and it would appear future Republican presidential hopeful, and author of the new book, God, Guns, Grits, and Gravy, which despite some assertions is not all about possum pie, sugared rice, and purple hull peas. Mike Huckabee is in the electronic house. Governor, thanks a lot for joining us.
Well, thank you, Ed. Gosh, you were sounding like you were given a great lunch menu there, Ed. I was getting pretty pumped.
See, now you can tell somebody who's actually been to Arkansas and knows all about the peas. There you go, instead of somebody just making fun of it. All right, let's talk about the meal that we got served, that the nation got served last night from the President of the United States. Is the President naive or simply just arrogant if he thinks that he's going to get away with all of these various assertions, vetoes, and threats?
Well, he's been doing the same thing for 6 years, so I guess he is going to continue in the final 2 years of his term to just dish it out like this. I was stunned that on one hand he said, I really want to work with you, and then turned around and said, now here's everything I'm going to veto if you put it in front of me. He said, I want to work with you, but I'm going to spend the next several weeks out campaigning all over the country telling everybody what a bunch of bums you are. The fact is, if he's serious about leading and being the chief executive, what he has to do is build relationships, sit down and spend time with those people, even the ones who don't like him and the ones he doesn't like. That's how you govern. And he just has never understood the art of governing, and it was never more clear than it was last night in the State of the Union, for which I stayed awake the whole time, and for that I'm very proud of myself.
So with what you just said here, the need to govern, the need to find a compromise, the need to work with somebody, if he has been doing this now for 6 years and he's not going to do it for the next 2 years, where do the Republicans go from here?
Well, they put pieces of legislation in front of him, even the ones they know he's going to veto, but they make him publicly explain why he vetoed it. So, for example, put the Iranian sanctions in front of him. You got Democrats who agree that having those sanctions lifted was a very bad idea. So put them back in front of him. Make him explain why it makes sense to let the Iranians have the boot off their neck and let them accelerate their nuclear program when we cannot trust them, and we never have been able to trust their government. Let him explain why he's going to veto the Keystone Pipeline, even though he's going to do that in a direct opposition to unions, to a lot of working class people who could use those jobs, and to Americans who could use better prices on their heating oil, on their fuel costs for their cars. Let him explain that. So whether it's reforms of Obamacare or the other things I've mentioned, put it out there. Don't put it in a big 2,000-page bill. Put it in a one-page bill. Put it on his desk. If he vetoes it, then I think that sets the Republicans up to say, we need a president who will sign this stuff, not one who will put a big X over it.
All right, now about a minute left before we take a break. Come back and talk a little bit more about you. Let's deal with the middle class issue here. People say, wait a minute, the Baltimore Sun said no brainer, common sense. You have to go ahead and do exactly what the president has talked about here. In your opinion then, I'll put you in the place of being a leader at this moment. What is it that the Republicans need to do right now to fire back and make sure that people don't come back and say, all you are is the party of no, and you're just a bunch of bigots against the middle class?
Well, the policies of this president have hurt the middle class. The actual unemployment rate, if you factor in the fact that we have the lowest job participation rate in 36 years, is more like 11.2%. So when he says it's the lowest unemployment, it's because a lot of people have given up looking for jobs. I think the Republicans need to be talking about if you're going to make a tax cut, rather than make a tax cut on the marginal rates, which you certainly ought to do, ease up on the payroll tax. That's instant money that happens next week in their pockets. It's not something they won't see until April or until next year. It's something they will see immediately. That kind of tax cut has instant benefits to working class people. Those are the sorts of things that they could put on the table. I would also suggest that they begin talking very, very seriously about looking at simpler tax rates. Ed, I'm still a fair tax guy. I think we ought to be taxing consumption and not productivity. But that's a hard pull, and it's something that can be accomplished soon. But there's some things they can do right away.
All right, we'll talk a little bit more. Hang tight just a minute. Governor Mike Huckabee returns after a short break with more about his immediate future. The question about who really is in charge, and new investigative reports just in time for a possible candidacy. It's all here on Midpoint. Let's welcome back to Midpoint former Republican governor of Arkansas, possibly and likely and just waiting for the official announcement of being a 2016 presidential candidate, which we'll address momentarily. Mike Huckabee joins us. Governor, Joni Ernst gave the Republican response to the president's State of the Union address. A new face, somebody certainly the Republicans want to get out there. But I've heard an awful lot of people say, wait a minute, at a time like this, we need to see the real leadership faces of Republican government right now. Perhaps John Boehner, perhaps Mitch McConnell. Nothing against Joni Ernst, but people are asking who really is in charge of the GOP at this point? Who really is that leader right now? Who is it?
Well, I like Mitch McConnell. I know John Boehner well. I've heard both of them speak. I think Joni Ernst was a much better choice to make a speech to the American people because she was very warm. She came across as sincere and authentic. I thought that the very tone and nature of her message last night was perfect because she talked about growing up, having to use plastic bread sacks to put on her shoes to keep them dry. You know, people out there in working class America can relate and identify to that. And I thought that was a very powerful kind of illustration of her own life. So I disagree. I campaigned with Joni Ernst in Iowa when she was running for the Senate seat. I found her to be an extraordinarily intelligent, thoughtful, and frankly, very compelling person. So I thought it was a good choice, and it kind of says, if you want to know who the face of the Republican Party is, it's not just, the hoity-toity people that have great amounts of wealth. It's the mom, the colonel in the National Guard who has done combat, but who has come back and now chosen to serve her country in a different way.
All right, Governor, let's deal with a couple of issues here. Earlier today, you are quoted as discussing the rights of the states and the Supreme Court with regard to gay marriage. According to a report from the Huffington Post, you said that a Supreme Court ruling expected this year on gay marriage would ultimately be moot because one branch of government does not overrule the other two. And you said, according to this, that states have the final say on gay marriage regardless of whether the Supreme Court rules that the couples have a constitutional right to marry. Let me ask first, did I quote you correctly?
Well, the Huffington Post didn't. You quoted them correctly, but here's the point I'm making. There's no such thing as judicial supremacy in the Constitution. The Supreme Court is not the supreme being. It is the Supreme Court, meaning that it is the highest court in the land, but it still is 1/3 of the government. The legislature and the executive branch are the other 2/3. And the court, while it can interpret a law, it can't make one. And until there is enacting and enabling legislation that is passed by Congress and signed by a president, or in the case of a state, a circuit court judge cannot make a law. Circuit court judge can say the one you have is not valid, but in order to create a new law, the legislature and the executive branch has to act. And I don't know why a lot of people, including lawyers and members of Congress, including the president, who supposedly taught constitutional law, I wonder, great, you went to law school, did you take 9th grade civics? This is so fundamental that any cursory reading of the Constitution would lead one to believe that the one branch of government cannot usurp the other two. And so, for example, when people say the president can't do what he's doing on executive orders because he has to have the congressional legislation that empowers him. Exactly. You can't govern with one branch of government doing what it wishes. Now, it's tedious and it's cumbersome, but the founders intended it to be that way so that you didn't have too much power in one place.
Okay, let me be sure of something. Let me interrupt you if I could, because we only have a couple of minutes. I want to make sure this is correct. Are you arguing that states should have the final say on gay marriage?
Well, if states have voted, and their people have voted, as many states have, I think it was like 34 states, that they affirmed the traditional definition of marriage, then if a judge says you can't have that definition, in order to issue a marriage license, you still have to go through that process, the constitutional process of legislation, signature by the governor.
However,
and when
you-
that happens,
you
then
will-
you have same-sex marriage.
However, you will agree that in Cooper versus Aaron, which was decided by the Supreme Court in 1958, it held that the states are bound by the Supreme Court's decisions and cannot choose to ignore them. Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals also affirmed that. That was a joint opinion by all 9 justices. Doesn't this then tell us that the Supreme Court makes the rules, and if the states go against it, aren't we basically talking about anarchy?
Well, I would not use the term anarchy. Look, the courts under the supremacy clause will argue that the states have to comply. Okay, let's say that they do. In fact, there's many instances in which they ultimately will. But until they comply, I mean, the federal government may say we're going to cut off all our funding. That may make the state comply. The federal government may say you won't have any highway funds. That may make the state comply. My point was not to say that this is the ideal, that you have this sort of standoff between the state and federal government. My point is that when you have a court that issues a ruling, it doesn't mean that the very next day it is in force in the sense that, let me give an example.
I only have about
When I was
15
governor, we had
seconds. You would still fight it then?
Okay, I'll do it quickly. When there's a school finance case that comes down from the state Supreme Court, you don't send different checks out the next day. The legislature has to create enabling legislation. That's what I think people are missing.
Okay, and we still need to look at that Supreme Court decision. We need to see what happens from there. And of course, we wish we had more time to follow up. I do want to point out again that the governor's book is called God, Guns, Grits, and Gravy. He's gracious enough to join us here. Governor Huckabee, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Ed. Great to be with you.
Take care. Midpoint continues.